What stopped me at the end of my own driveway wasn't grief, and it wasn't anger. It was recognition, the slow, horrible kind that settles into your chest before your mind has caught up. Because the woman moving through my living room, visible through the wide front window I'd specifically chosen so the afternoon light could pour in, was moving like someone who had forgotten she was allowed to stop. My name is Winifred Cross. I'm 63 years old, and I spent 31 of those years as a registered nurse, first in Birmingham, then in Denver, where I worked hospital shifts long enough that my feet stopped hurting somewhere around year 5 because the nerves just gave up. I know what exhaustion looks like on a body. I know the particular way a person holds their shoulders when they've stopped expecting things to get better. And standing there at the end of that flagstone walkway I'd had professionally laid 12 years ago, I recognized that posture on my daughter's frame like a scar I should have known to prevent. The house had cost me $420,000 when I bought it outright in 2012. Just before I accepted the travel nursing position in Colorado. I'd scrimped for 11 years before that. Double shifts, holiday overtime, weekends nobody else wanted, because I needed to know that if anything ever happened to me out there, my daughter would have something solid underneath her feet. Something no landlord could take away, no lease could expire on, no economy could repossess. I'd signed the deed over to her the morning I drove to the airport, stood in the notary's office still smelling like the coffee I'd spilled on my sleeve, and told her, "This is yours. All of it. Build something beautiful here." She had, for a while. I'd watched through grainy video calls as she painted the front room a warm terracotta that made the afternoon light glow like embers. I'd listened to her describe building her catering business, how she'd saved enough to buy commercial-grade equipment, how she'd started getting calls for wedding receptions and corporate lunches and retirement parties, how she'd hired 2 assistants by year 3. I used to forward her business card to everyone I knew in Alabama. My daughter makes the best sweet potato empanadas you've ever tasted. I'm not biased. Ask anyone who's had them. But the calls slowed down around year 7. I told myself she was busy. She was building something real, and real things demand your attention. Then the calls stopped being video and became just voice. Then the voice calls got shorter. Then it was mostly texts, brief and oddly formal. "Everything's fine, Mom. Don't worry. She's just tired." Except that last one had come from a number I didn't recognize. And when I asked about it, I got a reply 2 days later, saying my daughter had dropped her old phone in the sink. New number. Sorry for the confusion. It was her husband who'd sent that text. I didn't know it then. His name was Rowan. He'd appeared in her life during year 5 of my time in Denver. Tall, persuasive, the kind of charming that works on people who haven't learned to distrust charm yet. I'd met him twice in person. Both times he'd been warm and attentive. The kind of man who refills your water glass before you've noticed it's half empty, and then smiles like he's done you a favor. Both times something about him had felt like a rehearsed performance, but I'd talked myself out of that instinct, told myself I was just being protective, told myself she was happy. She'd sounded happy in the beginning. His mother, Clarabelle, had moved in with them after the wedding. My daughter had mentioned it like it was temporary. A few months, she'd said. Just until Clarabelle got settled after selling her place over in Tuscaloosa. That was 5 years ago. Standing at the end of my driveway with my carry-on at my feet, and the late September sun pushing hard against the back of my neck, I was only now beginning to understand the arithmetic of those years. I had come home because of my own health. A minor stroke, TIA the doctors called it, transient ischemic attack, which is medicine's way of saying a warning shot across the bow. I'd been sitting at my kitchen table in Denver eating oatmeal when my left hand went numb, and the words in my crossword puzzle stopped making sense for 47 seconds. I timed it. Old nurse habits. 47 seconds, and then everything snapped back, and I sat there in my quiet apartment and thought, "You have been alone in this city for 12 years, and your daughter doesn't call anymore, and you need to go home." I hadn't told anyone I was coming. I'd thought about it, but some bone-deep instinct that I've learned, after 3 decades in hospitals not to ignore, told me not to. The front door was unlocked. I still had my key, the original one from the closing, but I didn't need it. The door pushed open before I reached for my bag. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Expensive candles. Something vanilla and cedar, the kind that cost $40 at those boutique stores in Homewood. The second thing was the sound of a football game, volume cranked up the way people turn it up when they want an excuse not to hear anything else. And the third thing, the thing that made me go still just inside the entryway, was the arrangement of the room. My living room. My furniture, mostly. The sectional I'd chosen in a showroom in Vestavia Hills. The built-in bookshelves I'd had a carpenter install. The bay window with the window seat I'd upholstered in cream linen. Except the bookshelves now held someone else's golf trophies and framed sports memorabilia I had never seen. And sitting on my sectional like it had always belonged to him was Rowan, bare feet up on the cushions, remote in hand, not looking at the door. Beside him in the armchair, wrapped in a quilted robe at 4 in the afternoon, was a woman with silver-streaked hair and the practiced stillness of someone accustomed to being served. She was watching the game alongside him, holding a cup of something steaming, and she did not look up either. And there, on her knees near the kitchen pass-through, scrubbing the baseboards with a rag, was my daughter. She was so thin, I could see the shape of her shoulder blades through her shirt. Her hair, which she used to wear in beautiful natural twists she was so proud of, was pulled back in a limp bun that looked like it hadn't been properly washed in weeks. She was wearing a gray t-shirt with a bleach stain along the hem and sweatpants that bunched at her ankles because they'd been made for someone taller. My daughter has been 5'4" since she was 16 years old. I know because I measured her every birthday until she left for community college. And she never once found it embarrassing. She always stood straight for it. She was not standing straight now. The security panel beeped when I stepped fully inside. Rowan looked over first, the way men look when they're annoyed at an interruption. Then the woman in the chair turned. My daughter turned last. And what I saw in her face in those first 2 or 3 seconds, before she fully registered who I was blankness. Not the blankness of someone who doesn't recognize you. The blankness of someone who has learned to make their face empty before they know what's coming, the way you brace for impact before you know what's hitting you. She looked at me the way my patients used to look when a doctor walked in. Not who is this? What is this going to cost me? Then recognition moved across her face slowly, like light coming through a window being uncovered 1 inch at a time. And she didn't smile. She didn't move toward me. She looked sideways at Rowan. That look told me everything I needed to know. He had already stood, moving to fill the space between us, becoming the point of contact so that whatever came through the door had to go through him first. He smiled wide, extended his hand. "My wife's mother," he said. "What a surprise. Winnie, right? She talks about you all the time." My daughter didn't correct him on the nickname. She used to correct everyone on the nickname. She had been Winifred's daughter, formal and proud, since the day she was born, and she'd always said she'd carry that dignity herself. "I am Winifred Cross," I said, "and this is my daughter's house." The woman in the armchair set down her cup with careful precision. "Clarabelle," Rowan introduced her, his mother. She smiled at me with the smile of someone who has already won and is waiting for you to understand it. My daughter still hadn't come to hug me. I looked past both of them and said her name quietly. She flinched, not from recognition, but from the reflex of someone who has been trained to come when called and brace for whatever comes after. "She's been under the weather," Rowan said, tired. "Keeping up with a house this size is real work, you know how it is." "I bought this house so she wouldn't have to work herself to exhaustion inside it," I said. He laughed, the kind of laugh that isn't amused by anything. I asked about her catering business. Clarabelle answered before my daughter could open her mouth. Said my daughter had discovered the stress of running a business wasn't suited to her temperament, that she'd chosen to focus on family, on being a wife, that sometimes our dreams are bigger than our capabilities, and it takes wisdom to recognize that. She said all of this warmly, like she was paying a compliment instead of dismantling a person. I asked to speak with my daughter alone. Rowan said she had work to finish. I moved past him and walked directly to my daughter. She was still holding the rag. Her knuckles had gone pale around it. "Baby," I said quietly, "it's me, look at me." She lifted her eyes to mine, and I saw the thing that lives in the eyes of people who have been hurt for long enough that they've stopped expecting it to stop. I know that look. I have seen it in triage rooms and domestic violence units and the waiting areas of shelters. I had spent my entire career praying I would never see it looking back at me from my own child's face. "Please," she whispered, "don't make it worse." Not "don't make a scene," not "it's not what it looks like, don't make it worse." As though whatever had been happening in my house, while I was 2,000 miles away thinking she was building a life, she considered it still capable of getting worse. And she was afraid that my being here might be the thing that tipped it. I asked her to show me around the house. Rowan objected. I kept walking. She led me down the hall. My hall. The one I'd painted a warm cream and hung family photographs along, except the photographs were gone, replaced by framed landscape prints that meant nothing to anyone who had ever loved anyone who lived here. She paused outside the closed master bedroom door and did not go near it. At the end of the hall, past the linen closet and the small bathroom, was the utility room. A washer, a dryer, shelves of cleaning products, a folding table along the far wall, and on the floor beneath the shelving unit, shoved against the baseboard, was a narrow cot with a pillow in a pillowcase, so washed out it had lost its color entirely. "How long?" I said. 2 years, she said, barely above a whisper, "since I signed the house." I didn't trust myself to speak for a moment. I breathed in through my nose the way you learn to when a procedure requires a steady hand and there is no one else in the room who can do it. "You signed the house over," I said finally. She looked at the floor. She'd had a miscarriage, she told me, quiet as a confession, like it was something she was still ashamed of instead of something that had been done to her. She'd been on prescription sedatives for weeks, not sleeping right, barely eating. And Rowan had been kind that week, she said. The week she lost the baby, he'd been kind the way he had been in the very beginning, before things changed. He'd told her the paperwork was for tax purposes. Said it would protect them both, as a couple. He'd handed her a pen while she was medicated and grieving, and wanting so badly to believe things could still go back to the way they were at the start. The room felt very small. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. I typed a message to a number I had saved the day I signed the original deed 12 years ago. An estate attorney named Carlton Briggs, who had been practicing law in Birmingham since before I'd taken my first nursing exam. I had kept his number not because I expected to need it, but because the morning I handed my daughter everything I had spent 11 years building, I made sure there were protections I hoped she would never have to use. The message was 4 words and an address. "Here now, come fast." He replied in under a minute, "On my way." I slipped the phone back into my bag and walked back to the living room. Rowan was there, positioned between me and the front door, still performing composure. I asked him to show me the title transfer documents. Something moved across his face. Not fear yet, but the shadow that precedes it. He went to the filing cabinet along the far wall, the same cabinet where I used to keep my daughter's baby photographs and the cards she made me every Mother's Day in crayon, and he pulled out a manila folder. I opened it on the coffee table. The deed transfer was on top. I found the signature line and looked at it for a long time without speaking. I have birthday cards from my daughter going back 23 years. I have letters she wrote me when I first moved to Denver, full of updates about the neighborhood and the garden she was trying to grow in the backyard. Her handwriting has always had a particular quality to it. Open, unhurried, each letter given its full space on the page. It's the handwriting of someone who was taught to take their time and believe the effort mattered. The signature on that document looked like someone had started writing her name, and then the hand had lost its conviction halfway through and finished anyway. There were small stops in the ink where the pen had hesitated. The letters bunched together at the end like they were holding each other up. "That is not a free signature," I said. "Of course it is," Clarabelle said from the sofa. She signed of her own volition. "While she was on prescription sedatives, following a miscarriage," I said, and I looked directly at Clarabelle when I said it. A car pulled up outside 40 minutes after I'd sent my text. Carlton Briggs came through the door with a briefcase and the unhurried authority of someone who has spent decades knowing he will not be rushed. Behind him was a woman in a Shelby County Sheriff's Department uniform, Deputy Pierce, broad-shouldered and thorough-eyed, the kind of officers who enters a room and immediately begins cataloging what she sees. Rowan's composure left his face all at once when he saw the uniform. He started talking about harassment, about his rights, about what an ambush this was. Deputy Pierce listened without expression, and then asked to speak with my daughter. The deputy's voice gentled when she addressed her. She asked, simply, whether anyone in the house had hurt her. My daughter was still for a moment, the particular stillness of someone deciding whether the truth is safe. Then she reached for the collar of her shirt and pulled it aside just enough. The bruising had gone yellow and green at the edges, the way bruising does after a week or more. Old damage layered over older damage, the kind you only read correctly if you've spent years in triage rooms learning the difference between accident and intent. Deputy Pierce's jaw went tight. She asked my daughter where the marks had come from, and my daughter answered in sentences that didn't always finish, because she'd learned to gauge how much truth was safe to let out at one time, and some of those habits take a long while to unlearn. "When did you last eat a real meal?" I asked. She thought about it. "This morning," she said. "Whatever was left from what I made him for breakfast." Carlton had been working from his phone since he arrived. Now he spread documents across the coffee table, with the deliberate efficiency of someone who has been keeping things organized for 12 years specifically for a moment like this. He had pulled property records, business license transfers, bank records tied to my daughter's social security number through a firm he'd worked with for decades. "There was a joint account," he said, "opened between my daughter and Clarabelle approximately 6 weeks before the catering business sold. The sale proceeds, $130,000, had been deposited into that account. 2 days later, $89,000 of it had been transferred out, into a separate account. Clarabelle Pelham, sole account holder." Clarabelle stood up from the armchair, her robe pulled tight around her, her face pulling into the expression of someone who is about to explain why they are actually the victim in this situation. My daughter's voice stopped her. "You told me you were dying," my daughter said. The room went still. She said it again, a little louder. "You sat at my kitchen table, and you showed me the pamphlets and the appointment cards, and you cried. You told me your insurance wouldn't cover the procedure. You said you didn't want to be a burden on your son. You said I was your only hope and that God wouldn't forgive me if I let you die when I had the means to help." Her voice didn't crack. It had the steadiness of someone who has rehearsed this moment in their mind for a long time, who has lain awake on a cot in a utility room, recounting every detail of the afternoon they made the worst decision of their life, trying to understand how it happened. "I sold everything I built," my daughter said. "I sold my equipment and my client list and my contracts and everything I had worked for, because I thought I was saving your life." Carlton spoke then, quietly. He'd called 4 cardiology practices in Shelby County on his way over. None had a patient by the name of Clarabelle Pelham. He'd cross-referenced with the county health system as well. No procedure, no consultations, no record of treatment of any kind. Clarabelle's composure came apart the way plaster does. One thin crack first, then another, then a whole section giving way at once. She said she had been scared. She said the symptoms had been real, that she had been certain something was wrong, that the tests had just come back negative by some stroke of luck, and she had been so relieved. She said she had only taken the money as a cushion, a security measure, in case the diagnosis came later and they weren't prepared. My daughter looked at her, just looked at her, and then she said very quietly, "Don't." One word. It landed in the room with the weight of 2 years on a cot and 4 years of silence, and $130,000, and a business built from scratch dismantled in a single week, because someone she was trying to save have told her it was the right thing to do. Carlton turned to me. "The original deed," he said, "contains a protective clause. I drafted it at your request in 2012. If the property was ever transferred through coercion, under documented duress, or while the grantor was in a state of diminished capacity, illness, sedation, documented grief, the transfer is legally contestable and ownership reverts to you pending court review." Rowan moved forward. Carlton looked at him over his glasses with 12 years of patience behind his eyes and said, "I have the prescription records from the week of the transfer. I have the hospital documentation of the miscarriage. I have this signature, which any handwriting analyst will evaluate in approximately 30 seconds. And I have a protective clause drafted by a woman who loved her daughter enough to plan for the worst. You are welcome to contest it, but I would strongly recommend you retain counsel before you decide to try." Deputy Pierce called for a second unit. While we waited, she walked down the hall to the utility room. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the cot and the gray pillow and the folded blanket that had been washed so many times it had no weight left to it. She took photographs. She did not speak while she took them. When Rowan was handcuffed in my living room, he shouted. He said things about my daughter I will not repeat because they don't deserve to live anywhere outside of that room. He said things about me. He said the house was his and she had wanted him to have it, and we were tearing apart everything he'd built. Clarabelle wept as they walked her out to the second vehicle. She wept in the way of someone who has used tears successfully before and is making a calculated decision to try them again. They didn't work this time. After both cars had pulled away from the curb, my daughter and I stood in the living room without speaking for a while. She was still holding the cleaning rag. I reached over and gently took it out of her hand and set it on the coffee table, and we sat down together on my sectional. I made her eat. She hadn't had a real meal since that morning, and I went through my refrigerator, technically my refrigerator, in my kitchen, stocked with food she had purchased and other people had consumed most of. And I made her scrambled eggs and toast and sliced fruit because it was what I could make quickly and what I knew she'd been able to eat since she was 3 years old without any fuss. She sat at my kitchen table and ate slowly, like she was remembering that she didn't need to watch someone's face before she took each bite. I don't know how to start over, she said. Yes, you do, I told her. You've done it before, you'll do it again, and this time I'll be right here while you do. I wasn't going back to Denver. I had put in my notice before I boarded the plane, because I'd had 47 seconds in a kitchen in Colorado, where I understood that I had been running from grief, my husband's death, the guilt of leaving, the loneliness of all those years, and running toward a version of being useful that had cost me the only thing that had actually mattered. I was 63 years old. I had earned the right to stop running. The legal process took 4 months. Carlton was methodical and billed me fairly. The deed reverted. Rowan's attorney contested. The handwriting analysis came back in 10 days, and the case for duress was unambiguous. He pled down and still received 3 years. Clarabelle was charged with fraud and financial exploitation of a vulnerable person. The district attorney's office determined that targeting a woman in acute grief constituted targeting someone in a diminished state, and that the deception had been deliberate and well documented. She received 18 months and full restitution, which meant my daughter received her $130,000 back, with interest, plus what Clarabelle had spent on herself, calculated from her own bank records. My daughter used it to open a new kitchen. It's on Green Springs Highway, a small commercial space with better ventilation than her old setup, and twice the counter space. She had the walls painted the same warm terracotta she'd used in this living room, because she said she needed to see that color every morning. She hired back one of her original assistants, a young woman who had kept in touch across all those silent years, and cried for 20 minutes on the phone when my daughter called her out of what must have seemed like nowhere. On opening day, my daughter stood at the front of the space in a white chef's coat, with her name embroidered above the left pocket, her hair back in the natural twists she'd spent 3 weeks carefully growing out again. And she looked at the neighbors and former clients and 2 reporters from the local paper who'd come out to see her, and she said, "I was gone for a while, but I'm back now." I stood in the back and let myself cry for the first time in the entire ordeal, because I had been holding it together for 4 months straight. And I am 63 years old, and I have spent enough years taking care of other people's worst days, that I have more than earned the right to cry in the back of my daughter's kitchen on a Thursday afternoon. Someone in the crowd asked her what had kept her going during those years, when things were at their lowest. She thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "My mother told me the day she left for Denver that she'd put protections in place. She said, 'Baby, I hope you never need them, but they're there.' I never told my husband, because some part of me, even at my absolute lowest, remembered. Some part of me held on to that. I drove her home that evening, to my house, which is her house, which has always been her house. We sat on the front porch after dark the way we used to when she was small, and we lived in a rental in Ensley with a porch swing that squeaked on the left side. She used to fall asleep on my shoulder on summer nights, and I'd just sit there in the quiet dark, not wanting to move, not wanting to disturb what we had. She fell asleep on my shoulder again, sitting in a porch chair on a September night, on the porch of the house I had built for her, and I sat there in the stillness of it and thought about all the years I'd spent away. I can't get them back, I know that. But I had that night, and all the nights stretching out ahead of us, and that was more than enough to begin.